بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبي إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. I wish I had in fact funded the Islamic Text Institute. If I was that wealthy, it would have been a lot easier. Unfortunately, I just founded it and now we're looking for funding, so that's a good segue to a plug for funding instead of founding. I'm going to be speaking about this topic of Tawhīd, and you'll notice that I think a couple of points that Sayyid Sajjad mentioned, I'll be repeating them. It's not a bad thing, and it might actually kind of be an interesting thing to look at, because one of the things that we find, I think historically there's a dichotomy between theology and philosophy. And so oftentimes in our classical books, the theologians will kind of have caricatures of the philosophers as people who use their mind and disregard revelation and try to come up with everything from the existence of God to how to do wudu with their mind, which is not the case, but that's the caricature that's presented. And vice versa, the philosophers will think of theologians as being kind of shallow, kind of strict constructionists, people who look at the text and can't see beyond it, and like that kind of superficial people who are apologists, and also kind of just defending things that are already known rather than finding anything interesting. In the Shi'i context, though, that's not the case. In the Shi'i context, theology looks a lot like philosophy. A lot of philosophy is used by theologians to use logic, for instance, to rationally prove things, to demonstrate, in the words that he used as well, to prove rationally why we believe in certain things. Philosophy seems, in the Shia context, to be kind of leaning towards irfan, whereas theology in the Shia context uses a lot of philosophy. So there's repetition then for a reason, because there is actually an overlap between the two. I want to talk about three things in particular. The first is, I want to describe kind of a rational progression that we undergo naturally as we're moving towards faith in God. Right, we're using the word Tawhīd. I'm not going to talk about the oneness of God. Right, we use the word Tawhīd in Islamic texts, not simply for the oneness of God, but also just for anything having to do with God. Right, so everything having to do with Allah, His existence, His attributes, all of those things that go under the concept of Tawhīd. So that's how I'm approaching it as well. So I want to talk about kind of the progression that we go through a rational process to attain belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And part of my purpose in doing this is in part to respond to something I understood from Dr. Rizvi's discussion yesterday. And we had a little bit of a discussion back and forth, and it's a shame. I wish we could kind of go back and forth on this a little bit. But anyway, I get the last say because I'm up here last, but inshallah we can continue the discussion afterwards. But today, what I understood from him was something different. So it would be advantageous to actually have a back and forth so we can get to the reality rather than having speeches delayed by days, trying to uncover what each other's saying. But what I understood from what he said yesterday, which I didn't understand from today's discussion, was that we come to believe in God not rationally, but there are many other things that bring us into faith. And what I understood from that is that you can't necessarily know truth, and you can't know what you believe rationally. And I don't think that's what he's saying, because today it sounded very different and it sounded more like what I'm saying. So anyway, that's the reason for discussing that, kind of looking at how we go from kind of an empty state when I don't believe in anything to the point where I believe in God, and how I can understand that and go through that process in a rational way. A second area I want to discuss is to look at some of those external factors that influence why we believe. It's true that we don't only believe through reason. Right? Most people, the vast majority of people don't logically get to faith. They get to faith because they're born into it and from a variety of other reasons. And so it's interesting to look at those things too, because they do influence our belief in God, and it's important to keep those in mind. And then finally, I want to look at an interesting question, which is, what is the difference between someone who believes in God and someone who doesn't? If I believe in God, I've gotten to it rationally and through other factors, what makes me different from someone who doesn't believe in God? What does it matter? How does it change me as a person, and how will my actions in my life look different? All right, so first for the progression from a state of not believing to the point where I believe in God. So a lot of this stuff is things that hopefully you know, and I'm going to kind of go through it quickly. So we have one concept of the fitrah. We have this kind of an intuition that Allah has planted within us, an innate recognition of the divine with which He's created us. فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا, like we read in Surah Al-Rum. And so this is something that's planted within us, but it's not something that we necessarily recognize. So most of us do, or some people do, because maybe they've been raised in a way that fitrah is still kind of very fresh and very alive in them. But many people, because of environmental factors and confusion that arises, and for so many different reasons, they begin to ignore that fitrah within themselves. But that is nonetheless there. Oftentimes in theological books, when they offer proofs for the existence of God, they'll list the fitrah as one of the proofs, one of the demonstrations for why God exists, or how we know God exists. And that's not very good, because we can't use this as an argument. It's not a demonstration. I can't tell you God exists because deep down inside you know He exists. That doesn't make any sense to you. If you don't already recognize it, if it's not already something that you admit and you recognize, then what good is it for me to tell you that there's something within you that you just don't know? It doesn't help anything. So the fitrah is there. We know that from revelation, or we know that from self-reflection if we are able to know it, but that's about it. But there is a purpose for it, and we'll get back to the purpose as we go through this progression. So that's the first kind of first state that we're in, before we do any work on ourselves. The second step that we can take in our progression to developing faith is using rational arguments. Right? These rational arguments that have been constructed, they do the job of kind of establishing for ourselves, demonstrating that there is in fact an absolute being who is the cause of all causes. And in some cases, even some of the attributes, some of the essential attributes that God has, the rational proofs, without revelation, without the help of revelation, can help us to understand who God is and what kind of qualities He has. Through a process of reason, then, we can get to a point where, I'm going to have to skip over one crucial intermediary, which is we have to use our reason to establish revelation. Right? So we're talking about Allah and His attributes. Somewhere in the mix, you have to come to the point where you can establish that a particular revealed text, in our case the Quran, is in fact revealed from God. It's a miracle, inimitable, and through other different kinds of arguments, and understand and come to a point where you have certainty that the Quran is in fact from God, and that gives you access to not only what your mind tells you, but now you have revealed text as well. You have to have established the credibility of that Quran rationally before you can then open up the Quran and see, what does the Quran tell me about God, right? I can't simply assume that the Quran must be from God, open it up and see how it describes God, and say that must be how God is. Because there's a huge gap, there's a huge leap of faith that's involved there if I do it like that. And that leap of faith is, who knows if it's true or not. So there has to be a rational process to establish the credibility of the divine book of revelation, and then I can use that revelation and the teachings of the person who brought that revelation, our prophet and his successors, to then know God through revealed ideas, not just through my reason. One of the things that we understand from revelation is that there are different kinds of attributes of Allah, and sometimes when we learn attributes of Allah, you might have learned like a list of 99 names, for instance, right? And there are many more. Dua Joshan al-Kabir, for instance, has 1,000 different descriptions of Allah. And even that's not limited. That's not an exhaustive list, right? Any ism hasan is a name of Allah, an attribute of Allah. Any good quality, any perfection that is possible is first and foremost rooted in Allah, and only then do other things become describable through that attribute. So the attributes of Allah are many. They're not all at the same level, though. So think about a couple of attributes that you all are familiar with. We know that Allah is Rahman, for instance. Right? He has the quality of mercy. Well, we also know that He is, for instance, the sustainer, Ar-Raziq or Ar-Razaq. So these two attributes, they're not at the same level because in fact, being the sustainer is a subset of him being merciful. Right? So being merciful is like a higher level in the hierarchy, and then one of the kind of the offshoots of being merciful is that he guides us, he provides us with sustenance, he forgives us, and all these different other attributes. So they kind of come under rahmah, not at the same level as rahmah. So it's interesting to kind of see that relationship between the attributes. For instance, he's alim, and he's also sami and basir. He's all-knowing, and he's all-seeing and all-hearing. Being all-seeing and all-hearing are not separate from being all-knowing. All-knowing is at a higher level, and then he knows both those things that can be seen and also those things that can be heard. So those are a subset of the higher level, which is al-alim. So we understand those relationships and some of those attributes through revelation, which helps to kind of fill in the blanks and kind of give color to that bare bones structure that we have through our reason alone. And now we start to understand different attributes of Allah. One of the interesting kinds of attributes we understand from revelation is what are traditionally called sifatul fi'l. I translate them as relational attributes as opposed to essential attributes. So let me quickly kind of describe the difference between these two. Essential attributes are attributes that you can know of Allah that are knowable even if Allah is kind of in a vacuum. Meaning, think of Allah by himself before there's any creation. It's just Allah. And you can still understand that he exists. You can still understand, for instance, that he has knowledge, that he has infinite power. Right? There's certain attributes that we can know even if we don't compare him to anything else. But there's certain attributes. It doesn't make sense, for instance, if you think of Allah without anything, to say Allah is the creator. If he hasn't yet created, if he hasn't yet done it, then he's not yet the creator. So there's certain attributes that we only understand, that our mind can only fathom once we think of Allah in relation to something else. So once he provides, then he's ar-raziq. Once he creates, then he's al-khaliq, and so forth. So there are relational attributes like that are different from the essential attributes. All right, so those are things that we can know in our progression towards believing in God and knowing God with the help of revelation in addition to our reason. But this is still just theory. There's still just ideas and concepts in our head. At some point, we need to get back to the point where we actually translate that into practical knowledge of Allah. Right? It's one thing for me to know certain bio data about you. I meet you and we exchange names and occupations and educational backgrounds, these kinds of things. They're concepts that we know about each other, but it's not real knowledge. I don't really know you yet. But once I start to interact with you, we start to have questions and answers back and forth, and we start to discuss and engage. Maybe we have an argument and we resolve that, and we have different interactions like that. The more those interactions happen, the more I actually know you. And it becomes kind of something more tangible rather than something simply conceptual. So our experience with Allah has to be the same way. We can have conceptual knowledge of Allah through reason, but we also have to experience Allah, right? Interact with Him. And that's going to come about through primarily through worship. Right? One of the purposes of worship and having these conversations with Him is to establish, kind of to make that theory and those concepts real, to start to feel His presence in our lives, to connect with Him, especially at our most desperate times, at our most vulnerable times when we start to realize exactly who we are and exactly who He is. Right? Those are the times when these windows open up and we're able to start to experience Him in a way that's much more meaningful than theory. So what that's really doing is, if you think about it, the rational arguments and even the worship, what they're doing is that they are taking those embers of the fitrah that are latent within us, sometimes covered up with ashes, sometimes hidden and obscured, so we don't really realize that fitrah is there inside of us, through the process of reason, and then through that, with the help of revelation, we're able to fan those embers and light the flame. And when that flame is ignited, then we're on our way to actually knowing God in a way that's much more meaningful, and that's really the goal of life. Okay, so that's kind of something about the progression that we make towards faith in God and how we come to believe in God in a whirlwind sort of a way. I mean, the whirlwind is my explanation, not the actual experience and the progression. But the question is, so I'm going to kind of ignore what Sajjad said today and go back to what he said yesterday, because I think that's something that might be a concern or a doubt, and it's a valid point as well. That's not really the way most of us have come to faith. I would guess probably most of us in the room came into Islam because we were born into it, or possibly through marriage, or different factors like that. There are converts, and even converts think about maybe how they came into faith. Was it through rational arguments? For instance, if they were an atheist and they were presented with the cosmological argument or the teleological argument, did they say, "Aha, now I believe"? Or no? Were they influenced by, for instance, a good friend? They needed something emotionally, and they experienced Islam, and it gave them what they needed, and through that process, then they came into faith. And they kind of, took a leap at first, and then they came into Islam. So it is true that it is rare for somebody to come into Islam purely rationally, or any kind of set of beliefs, right? But that doesn't mean that the role of reason is any less than what I've explained. The role of reason and the role of these arguments, of these kind of logical demonstrations of the existence of God and his essential attributes, are extremely vital, extremely important. For the person who already believes, right, if we don't have reason for that faith, then there's really nothing. We've accepted something. What's the difference between me having fortunately, we've been born into a faith that happens to be true, and so we take it at face value and we accept it and we believe in it. If it's not based on reason, if I haven't come to Islam based on reason, then what's the difference between me and a follower of some other religion who also has been born into that faith and unthinkingly has accepted all of its tenets and simply practices it? There's no difference except the fact that I happen to have the right religion, they happen to have the wrong religion. So we have to have reasons, and our intellect is the tool that we can use to know whether or not the claims of a particular religion are true. So even if we don't kind of deal with religion in a purely rational way, we don't come into religion in a purely rational way, using the reason and using these arguments is still extremely important for not simply consoling. I don't know if I understood the term consoling correctly from his lecture, but what I understood from consoling was something like almost like it just makes you feel good, makes you feel comfortable with something. I'm saying something more than that. If that's in fact what was communicated, the logical arguments, the rational arguments, help us to know that this is in fact true. Not simply that it helps me to feel comfortable with being Muslim, that I feel now justified that this feels good and this is good enough and I'm okay being Muslim, but rather I need to get to the point where I know, in fact, that there is one God and not multiple gods like other religions might profess. I need to know that this particular manifestation of religion, which is Islam, is in fact true, and my responsibility right now to my Creator is not some other form of belief and practice, but that this particular set of beliefs and practices is what I'm responsible for, and this is what I'm going to be held accountable to for. So there is a purpose in using these rational arguments. Right? Even if we don't come to a religion through these, we need to use them to affirm our belief and to make sure that the beliefs that we have are in fact true. So certainly there are external factors as well. So let me move to the second part of what I wanted to talk about. There are external factors that influence us in our path to faith. Right? So it's not purely logical. Practically speaking, most of us come to faith, like I mentioned, in various different ways. One of those ways is through tawfiq, right? Divine grace. So tawfiq of Allah is kind of how He facilitates things to happen. How He literally brings things together. He brings things that are wafq to one another. So certainly the fact that we have been born Muslim, or we have accepted Islam, or we have started to think about Islam and use our reason to reaffirm what we were born into, that is itself a tawfiq from Allah, a kind of a grace that He's given us. Just think of the fact that it takes inspiration, it takes motivation to do that. It takes effort, even something like just coming here, attending something like this, which is an activity where you're hoping to learn something, you're trying to learn something. That itself is a kind of tawfiq from Allah, that He's facilitated that by giving you the means, by giving you the time, by giving you the motivation to be able to do that, make that effort. To read a book, to listen to a lecture, to engage in a discussion, all of those require so many things to happen before that thing can happen. There's an immense amount of divine grace in that. And so the tawfiq of Allah is essential for us to come into faith. But the tawfiq of Allah is not arbitrary. Right? So it's not given arbitrarily, and I happen to have been given tawfiq, that's why I'm Muslim or I'm Shi'i. Right? But somebody else who's not, Allah decided not to give them tawfiq. It was arbitrary. He flipped a coin and one got it, one didn't get it. Obviously that's not the case. Right? He does everything for reason. He does everything with cause. And so there are efforts that we ourselves have to make. This kind of gets at the difference between Rahman and Rahim. Right? When we understand the difference between Rahman and Rahim, one of the things that we understand from our exegetes is that, and also from actually, even before the exegetes, from the Imams themselves, that there's a difference in the mercy that's described by Rahman as opposed to Rahim. Now, Rahman I think of as kind of a broadcast mercy, especially with regards to guidance. Allah guides us in a broadcast sort of a way. We have, instead of broadcast, let's think of Wi-Fi. Right? So you have a Wi-Fi of guidance that's everywhere, accessible to all, but not necessarily received by all. Right? So the Wi-Fi waves that are going through the room, not all of us are attuned to it. It's just, if we have the proper device and the proper tools to be able to get to it, then we're able to access that. And so the guidance that Allah gives to all is then responded to favorably by a few. And when you take that step and you accept that guidance from Allah, then He reinforces your guidance and gives you more. But if you ignore it, then there's nothing else for you. It's your problem. Of course, He's not that cavalier. He'll give you more and more and more and keep on giving you that broadcast. But eventually that's what happens. If you seal yourself off, then He'll seal you off. Right? Allah says, وَيَزِيدُ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ اهْتَدَوْا هُدًى. So those who do ihtida, those who receive the guidance from Allah, that initial broadcast, they accept it, they take it, then He increases them in additional guidance and gives you more tawfiq and furthers your faith. So that's the tawfiq is not arbitrary, but it's based on our favorable response to the broadcast guidance that He gives us. It's also not static. The tawfiq of Allah is not static, and that's very important to know. Just because until now God has given me tawfiq doesn't mean that it's going to continue. I need to continually renew that covenant with Him, continually further myself and keep doing what I'm supposed to be doing and furthering myself in order for His tawfiq to continue. And if I cease, then He can very easily retract and take away the tawfiq, and then I'll be left in misguidance. Right? And vice versa, if I've been misguided until now and I haven't had the tawfiq, that doesn't mean I'm doomed. Right? Until now I was doomed, but it's in my hands. All I have to do is respond. The guidance is there for me. The tawfiq is all there for me. If I respond favorably, this moment, even though I have never responded before, then that's good enough for Him, and His whole system will kick in, and the tawfiqat will start, and that guidance will continue. So the grace of Allah is definitely one important factor in helping us to come to faith. Community, culture, these are also incredibly important factors in helping us to be faithful, right? Just think of the congregational prayer, for instance. When you pray Furad, the emphasis that's put on Jama'ah prayer, right? One of the reasons for that, if you can think of yourself, if you're anything like me, when I pray by myself versus when I pray in a Jama'ah, it's totally different. Right? Every once in a while, I might have the tawfiq to pray a good prayer all by myself. Right? But when I pray in Jama'ah, there's a kind of this communal aspect where now you can't rush through the prayer because you have to pray with everyone else and keep up with them. So if you're by yourself, you might rush through it and kind of just do the wajibat and get it done so you can get on to something else. But now when you're with the Jama'ah, it slows you down. You got to take your time. You got to go with the Jama'ah and pray. You have to, whatever surah is being recited by the Imam is what you have to listen to. You can't take a shortcut and recite a short surah to get it over with. Right? So it pushes you up, hopefully, for the most part, it's going to bring us up and kind of level our engagement with prayer so that it's kind of more constant rather than sporadic nature that it would otherwise be if it was just us by ourselves, praying by ourselves, and it was a personal thing. When it's communal, then it has this greater effect. And so that communal aspect is super important for people who don't have it. When they see it, when they see communal prayer, and they see community activities and these kinds of things, that has a huge impact on them, and they feel like, I also want to belong to a group like this. And so if nothing else, even if I don't know for a fact that all the tenets of Islam are true, because I like the community of Muslims, I want to be like them and I want to join them. Which is not to say that's wrong or that's bad, but it can't be the end of it, right? Once they come into faith, they'll have to still go through that rational process to affirm the tenets. But this is something that we should also realize and know, that the culture of Muslims and the society of Muslims, the way we do things, is a very important thing. And if we should make it in such a way that it's attractive and it brings people in. I think of how the Prophet ﷺ, how he attracted people sometimes. Right? We have the mu'allafatu qulubuhum. Right? The mu'allafatu qulubuhum were people like Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah, who were straddling the fence. At best. Right? If not completely kafir, but they're kind of straddling the fence, at least in a public way, where they could have gone either way. And so he kind of uses money, uses the spoils of war, his own share of khums from the shares of the spoils of war, and he gives exorbitant sums to these people who are mu'allafat qulubuhum to sway them in favor of being Muslim and staying Muslim. Right? So he uses something that's not rational at all. These people presumably wouldn't have cared about the reasons behind why to be Muslim. But they cared about money, and if Islam, being Muslim, is going to pay better, then why not? They're used to being rich and powerful. If the Prophet's willing to make us rich and powerful as Muslims, why not? And so there's other purposes being served. Faith for them was something that was kind of a moot point, but it was useful to keep them, at least to make them not be our open enemies, even if they're munafiqeen and kind of within our ranks. That's better. We can keep an eye on the better than if they're our sworn enemies. And so he uses other things besides reason. That's my point. He uses other things besides reason, and there are also other things in our lives besides reason that influence us and help us to come to faith. Can I know how much time I have left? Okay. Let me move on to the third topic. So what's the difference between a Muslim or someone who believes in God and someone who doesn't? Let me move away from the script a little bit to make this more efficient. So I recently read a book by somebody named Alain de Botton, if I pronounce his name correctly. Alain de Botton, B-O-T-T-O-N, Botton. He has written a book called Religion for Atheists. I found it very interesting. I heard about him through a radio program, and then I followed up reading his book. And one of the things he advocates for, he's an atheist, an avowed atheist, and he advocates for atheists to kind of reappropriate, in his words, to reappropriate religious practice for themselves. So he says that one of the problems that atheists face is that they're left with kind of a void where they don't know how to deal with, they don't have any system, for instance, to deal with hardships of life and to deal with societal, kind of the void of not having a cohesive society to deal with. Right? And these are things that he says religion does very well. It provides you with consolation and explanation for how to deal with life, and it brings you together with co-religionists, and you do these different rituals and stuff, and it gives some meaning to life. So he says, absolutely, none of this is true. That's his point. None of this is true. I don't believe in any of this religion. There's no God. There's no truth to religion. However, it's very useful. Right? It's useful, and atheists should also, for instance, gather and sing hymns. And I don't know, have sacred dance and experience sacred art and these kinds of things, because it adds meaning to their life, right? So this got me to think about this situation that we're in. What is the difference between? Well, think of it like this. So if an atheist is going through all the same rituals that we are going through. Say they find that the salah and jama'ah is something that's useful for them, and they go through the motions and do it. They find that fasting is very refreshing and rejuvenating, and it's kind of a good exercise, and they find it, the whole idea of coming together for iftar and these kinds of things is very nice. So they start doing it, right? And on and on through all the different rituals of Islam. What then is different about that atheist practice of those rituals versus someone who actually believes and does those things because it's something that God wants from him, and it's a duty that he sees on himself? So you might think that there is really no difference. The actions are the same. Goodness is goodness, no matter what the motivation might be. If I'm giving charity, if I'm going to give you money in charity, what does it matter whether I believe in God or not? The money's still real. It still helps you. It still fulfills some void in your life economically and gets you on your way. So it doesn't matter then that I have faith or don't have faith. That's his point, that there is no difference. The benefit of both acts of charity is the same. Right? The person walks away with money in his pocket and he's able to fill his stomach, whether I believe in God or not. So are the acts in fact the same? The acts of all of our actions are not simply the shell of the act. It's not the act itself that we look at. The act is simply that shell, but the kernel of that act is the motivation and the intention that goes into the act. So yes, if I give charity without belief, or for the sake of, because it makes me feel good, then that particular goal can be accomplished. I can satisfy your need. I can make myself feel good. So it's kind of a way to placate my own need to do something good. But then that's the end of it. As soon as I connect that deed, though, with something deeper, with something that's eternal, with Allah Himself, that deed then takes on meaning. It's no longer limited to the dunya, to the temporal world, but now it actually takes on meaning in terms of, for instance, this act, if I'm doing it for the sake of, out of obedience to Allah, right? Because it's now connected to Him, He's going to record that deed for eternity. He's going to reward me for that deed, also potentially for eternity. Right? So that limited deed that might take place in a limited amount of time and have kind of a beginning and an end, as soon as it becomes connected to something infinite, it becomes infinite also. Right? The Quran says, مَا عِنْدَكُمْ يَنْفَدْ وَمَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ بَاقٍ. In Surah An-Nahl, Allah says that whatever is kind of with us, limited to us, it's limited. It's kind of, it has a beginning and an end. It's going to, I do the act, and once I do the act, I give you the money, you buy some food, you fill your stomach, and that's it. That's the end of that deed. Right? But مَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ بَاقٍ. As soon as that deed is then connected to Allah, it takes on infinite proportions, and that same limited act can have eternal consequences. So there's a huge difference in acts. Simply giving charity is not the goal, but the intention behind it, if it's connected to Allah, or for instance, just think of a more kind of down-to-earth example. If I give that charity with the intention that I'm going to try to help you, then you can see there's goodness in that. Even if it's limited goodness, if it's simply for the sake of helping the person without doing it for some greater cause. But if I do that same act of charity, but now I do it to degrade you, right? Instead of offering it to you as a gift with respect and honor, if I give it to you and I want to show people how lowly you are, that you need my help, and how great I am that I can extend my hand to help you. The act might look exactly the same. If you take a snapshot of both those two acts, they might look the same on the surface. The shell is the same, but clearly, because the intentions are completely disparate, there's a huge difference between the two in their quality, and they're not one and the same. Recite one salawat, please. Okay, let me close there. Okay, and just in time. So the idea then was to talk about Tawhīd. We talked about it. I wanted to establish kind of the continuum and how one goes and progresses from not believing to believing in God. That's a rational process. And even if our personal journeys were not rational, that reason and demonstration and these kinds of things play an important role, a vital role in making sure that we revisit our faith, we reaffirm our faith. It's real for us. It's not simply out of taqleed, that because I'm born in this or because someone has said it's true, I accept it's true, but we actually go through the process to justify it for ourselves, not simply to make ourselves feel good, but to actually realize whether or not what I believe is true. And that's an important process. There are certainly other factors that play into our faith, and those are also important to pay attention to, especially on the side of us as a society, that we should design our community and kind of maintain our community in a way that other people aspire to be part of it. So even if they don't logically see the truth of Islam, they'll see the attractiveness of Muslims and Muslim society and the Muslim lifestyle, and at least that will create something, a spark in them, and awaken that fitrah within them, so that they come to Islam with at least as an exploration to see whether it is in fact true or not, whether it really satisfies something real in them or not. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.